Well, having taught college-level art classes for nearly 50 years, I came up with some ideas, finally, as to what I've been doing all this time in those 50 years. Thinking about art, but really in a sort of a different way. I have to explain, first of all, that I don't use the term art. I don't use the word art as in a qualitative sense. That is to say, you know, like some people say, oh, now that is art. I don't use it to suggest only the very best. I use it instead to describe what I consider to be a process of creative thinking. Okay? It is a process. Now, in an art class, a student makes a painting or a drawing. It could be pretty good, or it could be pretty bad. But that doesn't negate the fact that he's making art. That indeed he is creative thinking about doing something that he wants or she wants to do. Some cultures in this world do not even have a word for art. They simply say they just do everything as best they can with everything they have. The Maoris in New Zealand have an interesting concept, and that is that they will not accept a depiction of any of their deities unless they evoke the proper response in their followers. That is to say, it can be made with the best of intentions, the greatest technique, craftsmanship, all the knowledge of traditions. But if it doesn't have the soul, imagination, and passion of the artist, it's deemed poorly done. You know, that's not a bad criteria to figure out what the difference is between good and bad art. And this criteria seems to me we can use in any possible process of creative thinking, be it painting, drawing, snowboarding, okay, planning a musical festival, cooking, gardening, doctoring, teaching. Any of those that use some sort of creative thinking in them, we can say that the difference would be the passion that that maker infuses into that. Now, we have, therefore, an idea of how art is made. It is made in different ways. I have thoughts about this process of art, okay? And remember that it is a process. Remember, when you hear the word art, you're thinking process. Art to me was the first science. It was a creative expression of the imagination to be able to explain the phenomena of the world. Art was the first pictorial language because those ideas had to be illustrated on those cavern walls, on rocks, painted, brushed on, rubbed on. Art was the first religion. Those images were going to be worshipped. Those images were going to be worshipped because they somehow wanted to make order out of the chaos of everyday life. And art was the first magic because those prayers worked many times. There was a successful hunt. They had a successful day of foraging for food. Okay? So, in other words, all of these things, okay, are processes. But wait, talking about magic, In that Neolithic cave, there was already magic. I don't know if any of you have been to see the cave paintings in France and Spain, but you don't see them at the entrance of the caves where any casual Neolithic person would walk by and say, oh yeah, hey, pretty cool. No. They were deep inside that cave, as if they were made to be in the very center of the earth, the very center of power. You had to light torches to carefully walk into that dark cavern to find them, and then, of course, to have the elders explain them. Every culture, every civilization that we have had in this world has in some way gone beyond simply making things to survive their lives. They've instead, using their imaginations, have created something of their lives, something of their beliefs. They have documented their cultures. In other words, they've used their imagination to make the ordinary extraordinary. And let me give you some examples. The Tlingit of West Canada, they didn't just, and they don't, in fact, still, don't just weave blankets and ceremonial robes, but instead cover them with their sacred clan animals to give you an idea of their beliefs. The ancient Anasazi of the southwestern United States just didn't make bowls to eat out of. They decorated them with their beliefs of the inner relationship between themselves and the world outside. The Egyptians, they didn't just make walls to hold up their tombs and temples. They decorated them, and decoration, of course, is a bit weak of a word, but they covered them with their ideas of their deities and of their leaders so that the entire culture will know. The Yoruba of Nigeria just didn't make clothes, don't make clothes to simply garb themselves, but instead use colors and patterns to make a connection to their ancestors. In Japan, the Zen monks and artists don't just make simple gardens. Instead, they make spiritual landscapes that will lead to enlightenment about the wonders of the world. In Europe, the Gothic churches, with those high ceilings, they just didn't build them to house the believers. They instead built them so that those believers would think that those prayers were going right to heaven and to speak directly to the gods. The Huichol of Mexico don't just make yarn paintings to decorate their homes, but they cover them with their cosmic gods as a form of protection. Now, all this history comes to a very interesting change in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution comes along, and one of the most important things that comes with it is the invention of photography. Artists, painters, they're no longer asked to do a replica of a bowl of fruit. Camera can do that. What they're called upon now, and what they themselves have to think about, is how to use their imagination. How are they going to portray their inner beliefs and inner feelings? Art goes through a tremendous change. The expressionist artists of Europe, the Fauves, for instance, had to ask themselves, why does a tree have to be brown? Why does a street have to be gray? In other words, each one now wanted to paint their inner visions. And that's what was called for. A little bit later, Pablo Picasso describes human imagination as looking at one thing and seeing another. Pablo, what do you mean by that? It means a man looking at a plowed field and seeing a collage of fabric, patterns, and remnants. It means a woman walking by a garden and seeing the unfurling of a flower and seeing the idea of a great concert hall. It means a young boy looking up into the sky to see an eagle soaring motionless on a thermal of air and seeing the idea for a manned glider. Now, it wasn't just the artist that went through this tremendous change of the use of the human imagination, it was the audience. The audience was then suddenly called upon to be participatory. They had to join in. They had to understand now what those pictures were all about. They had to use their imagination. Such as, you look at a painting by Van Gogh, and he suggests with just a few brushstrokes what it might be about. But the audience then had to somehow complete the idea. Now, in the 20th and 21st century, people throughout the world, from the great business centers, streamed to opera houses, to theaters, to movies, art museums, galleries. They are looking for that passion. They are looking for those pictures of imagination. There are people that come tired from work. Every day they come home, and somehow they seem to have enough energy to knit that scarf, to knit that scarf, I like that, to work on that painting, okay? To finish something of creative thinking, even to make somehow a creative meal. Our culture seems to be very, very obsessed right now with adult coloring books. Have you been to Costco lately? And also paint parties. All of these ways and all of these methods that I've just mentioned in the last few sentences, these are all ways and techniques and processes that people are trying to find to make a personal balance in their lives between what they need to do to survive and somehow the need to replenish their creative souls. So what is the point of all this? Well, it is that the imagination is born of stimulation. And it's nurtured in part by our society. It begins in elementary school. It begins in the grammar schools. You can imagine a child or a classroom of children painting wonderful pictures with bright colors and flowers, or perhaps touching a musical instrument for the first time and possibly learning how to play it. Or sitting down quietly listening to a compelling story told to them by their teachers. And then those kids grow up. They go to secondary school, and what do they find? Less and less offerings of the arts in our secondary schools. Where is the stimulation going to come from for those young minds? How will the diminished use of those imaginations serve us in our society when more and more employers are looking more and more for critical thinking in their new hires? There has to be a world that we provide that not only values and encourages intelligence, but express passion and creative thinking. There has to be a public outcry for more support, greater funding for the arts in our schools. There has to be a way by which we use that early stimulation in those children's brains to further our own generation, to further our own country. How will a young George O'Keeffe or a young Frank Gehry ever think that what they do matters to others if we somehow do not honor the arts? Be it a play, a painting, a poem, or a piece of music. It is the creation that is the most human of our endeavors. Let's go back to that cave. Metaphorically speaking, we are still in that Neolithic cave. And we are looking for, we are searching for, possibly finding, or possibly even creating those images on the walls. And those images will complete this very core of our existence. And sum it all up, pretty smart man, Albert Einstein, I think you've heard of him. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Thank you.